I was trying to think about what is the best secret to building a successful company, and I think you need to have a Vinod. I met Vinod 30 plus years ago, and you need somebody who's got a keen product sense, a driving passion, commits himself in his body, soul, and spirit to being successful, and that's a pretty good model. Now, maybe you need some other things as well. So Vinod asked me to talk about a few things based on what I've seen, and I think it's probably even more interesting just to hear your questions. I think you need to have the right culture, and I think you need to have the right mission. And your mission should not be boring. So if you find that you have a boring mission from the marketing person, you need another marketing person. So I suggest, for example, building better technology, possibly leading to the betterment of mankind. Okay. Or if you're a politician, re-elect Obama, who really does understand what it takes to be president, plus the other guys are really scary. Or if you're a Republican, well, re-elect us because we will keep the country safe, and the other guys will tax you to death. The important point is you need to have something that gets people excited, as opposed to, make the world a better place in and of itself. And I think you need something that's pretty quantifiable. So in our case, we use very strong metrics, 100 million Chrome users. Or if you look at the presidency, another obvious ones, it's relatively simple. A simple majority of electoral votes needed to win the presidency. So if you can't say, sort of in a fun and quirky way, what you're trying to do, and you can't measure it, it's not going to happen. And it's not going to happen because human systems just don't work this way. And I was thinking about management. It's a lost point in this discussion, but meetings are what managers do. Otherwise, why are you bothering to have a meeting? Right. So actually doing them well is actually worth taking some time. And part of, I think, the best way to deal with meetings is to understand that you are not trying to get to consensus, you're trying to get to the best idea. So a typical example is you'll be sitting around and you'll either have a big argument or everyone will say yes. Well, if everybody says yes without too much of a fight, you've clearly not worked very hard. So for example, you're going to get a better performance. There's a lot of literature on this if there's a big argument about something, because people then bring their points out. Now, if you just have a big argument with no resolution, that's called a university, right? Everybody has a strong opinion, everybody gets heard, nothing happens, right? So you need to have a forcing function. Sorry, John Hennessy, who's here. You need to have a forcing function. You need to have a deadline or a meeting or something. You have to have something that forces an outcome. So the sum of getting people together, right, getting people to talk to each other, and then basically forcing a deadline is pretty key. What's interesting is that as a young manager, it took me a long time to figure out that you actually have to stoke this, that you actually have to ask people. When I was at Novell, what happened was I learned that there was something, it actually had a name. It was called the Novell nod. And everyone would say yes, and then they would leave the room, and they would immediately go do whatever they were going to do independent of the decision, right? That will kill you. Don't let it happen. When you're in these meetings, if you're using the word I a lot, that indicates you're talking about yourself. It's a key rule to remember. And when you sort of put people together, you have to sort of get people excited. What we did, which worked very well at Google, and still do, is we have trip reports. Because the people we work with are fascinating people, right, in and of themselves, and they have interesting observations. And inevitably, because somebody's always traveling to see a customer or do a partner or something like that, they bring up the issues that are current in the corporation. Obviously, by the way, you need to focus on measurable objectives. At Google, we use something called OKRs, objectives and key results, and we measure them basically on a quarterly basis. In a smaller company, I think you'd write them down monthly. If you're not doing that, again, you're not running the thing tightly enough. In my case as a young executive, I figure these are good people, they're working really hard. You can't really get what you want unless you know you have a plan and you have a way of getting there and you've actually thought it through. Hope is not a plan, right? It's important to understand hope is fine. You need the details as well. But basically, if you have this combination of some sort of real dissent along with a focus on bringing up the best ideas as opposed to a consensus idea, then you'll be fine. And sometimes, by the way, the best idea is not your idea. Often entrepreneurs, hopefully not in this room, are so arrogant that they actually don't listen to anybody. And you want a certain amount of arrogance, because you have to be confident that you can actually change the world. But ultimately, the best ideas come from everywhere. One of the things you learn as companies get larger is there's an awful lot of smart people not in your company. And it's often a shock to the people in the company. But the fact of the matter is, and as you get older, I think you get a little bit of perspective that there might be smarter people who are actually younger than you. And again, I think all of us will learn this as we go along. But another interesting thing about decision making is that most decisions do not actually need to be made by the general manager or the president. But a few decisions are crucial, and they have to be made. And you learn as you grow and you manage these organizations. What I always try to do is, what are the things that are going to happen without my intervention? Right? Just let those things go on. Right? Monitor them, talk to them. Ronald Reagan said, trust but verify. I trust everybody I verify too. But those things are going to be fine. But there's a few things that you've got to get right, and ultimately you have to drive it. It's a strategic decision, it's an investment decision, it's a particular deal decision. You have to do it. Spend 80% of your time on that. Make sure you know what it is. When you're in meetings and with people, find a way to make people smile as they leave your office. This, by the way, is it's completely unappreciated in my view. Praise is underused and underappreciated. People never get tired of pictures of themselves. It's shocking. Praise, they never get tired of that either. Feeling good about themselves, they're never tired of that either. It works. It works this year. It worked last year. It'll work next year. It'll work 10 years from now. Sorry, you have to figure out a way to get them to smile as they leave your office. Another example. My rule is very simple. Internal coordination hurts things, lack of internal coordination hurts things more than anything you do externally, with a few exceptions. Return the internal phone call first. You know how they always say, treat the customer first? Not true. Make sure you've got your act together before you call the customer. Because inevitably, everything that we do is done by teams now. Return your internal email first. You have to return the external one too, by the way. Please don't omit that. But make sure that your internal coordination ultimately kills execution. And businesses are about execution. It's obvious if you think about it. Never waste a crisis. Crises come along. They're very, very useful. Everyone's upset, properly so. Try to figure out what you're trying to get out of that. Almost all mistakes made in successful businesses are about time. I should have done such and such sooner. I should have acted sooner. I allowed a competitor to enter the space. I had the components of essentially competing or blocking their entry or whatever I was going to do competitively, and off I could do. I want to finish and talk about hiring and then get your comments or questions on all of this. Recruiting is the best check and balance on an organization, and recruiting is almost always done the wrong way. Here, since I was nasty about universities before, let me tell you how universities do it very well. They have search committees. They don't allow the buddy of so-and-so to hire the next professor of X, Y, or Z. They have a search committee. They do a proper job. They take a look at the quality of their work. They have a set of candidates. They have a team decision. All the evidence is that that produces much better outcomes. So if you're going to hire people who are going to do the job with you or without you, and do it through a hiring committee. This is a Warren Buffett rule. So Larry Inserga and I went to visit Warren Buffett, which was very entertaining. And he explained that his entire thesis about businesses is he acquires businesses where the person doesn't really need him but will tolerate him as his boss. He's so busy running this business and so passionate about it and loves it so much that what Warren does is he brings other assets, money or financials or what have you. But ultimately, he works with people who are so passionate, he doesn't have to worry about them. So he doesn't have to manage them. He doesn't have to micromanage them. He has to worry about them every day. Right? He explained he was too old to deal with all that kind of stress. This has been his philosophy when he was young, too, of course. And what's interesting is that organizations get naturally bloated and less efficient over time for many, many reasons. Partly because everybody wants to be a boss of somebody else, so you get these management chains of 12 people, right? One person working for one person, and so forth and so on, which is, of course, crazy. But the best check on that is recruiting. So not only should you use hiring committees, we started off with this bizarre structure where we didn't manage it. We ultimately figured out statistically that if 5 people interview somebody, that is the statistically smallest number that will give us an accurate predictor of whether we should hire that person or not. And your number may be different, but that's roughly how we've ultimately operated. And with those 5 people serving as a hiring committee, make sure you understand how you're hiring, how to avoid hiring glue. Glue people are nice people who you don't really need. They sort of provide glue. I'd much rather have the 2 principals talking than talking through an intermediate. And you sit there and you say, well, I only have 50 people in my company. Well, every single one of them wants somebody else that they can talk to who's not as good as them, as opposed to somebody who's better than them. Your job is to make sure you police that very well. And of course, you want to hire smart over nice and smart over experience. Experience is overrated. And I say that as the person who was brought in because I had experience. The fundamental thing about what you want is IQ, because in these businesses, everything changes. Now, maybe experience is important in businesses that are highly predictable, but if it were highly predictable, Vinod and his team would not be involved in it. I mean, these are people who enjoy taking risks. That's why you're all here. That's why you joined what you did. The fact of the matter is you need people who can adapt. At Google, almost everything changed for almost everybody. And it's a mark of the corporation that the people were smart enough that they could adapt, that they could figure it out. And by the way, it's changing again, and we're busy changing again, and so forth. And let me finish by saying that I opened by talking about arrogance. It's always a difficult subject, but the fact of the matter is all of us have some of it. But I would encourage people to think about humility. Humility helps. Winning organizations are naturally arrogant. Understanding that there's a competitive threat around the corner, that there's always another startup, there's always another 2 brilliant people coming out of Stanford or whatever, keeps you honest and allows you to avoid the kind of mistakes that I've made in my career. So I hope that all helped. I'm happy to answer any questions or Vinod, any comments from you. Okay.
Thanks, Eric. So I thought we'd take a few questions from the audience. I actually will ask the first one. As many people here know, I'm pretty big on hiring and recruiting and spend an inordinate amount of my time on that in often frustratingly multiple interviews. You talked about hiring really high IQ people. I find most people are hiring functionally. I need a VP of engineering or a VP of sales. What do you look for beyond the IQ, which you've already mentioned, and the function itself? And relatively, how would you trade off functional excellence, I'm a good sales guy, versus other features you look for in people?
Again, we would bias against the functional side and in favor of the general side. In practice, because you have an HR organization and because of the EEOC rules and so forth, you have to write down job descriptions. So you end up in this functional hiring structure, but the right structure is just to hire the smartest people. Since they'll segment themselves anyway, we typically, when we hire engineers, we don't tell them what they're going to work on, so we solve that problem. With marketing folks, we actually have them do a marketing pitch, and with salespeople, we have them do a sales pitch. Obviously, they don't know what they're going to be selling, and that turns out to be a pretty good selection bias. With managers, we have them write a 2-page essay, which basically says what would they do in their first 6 months in the company. At the end, we throw it away. But the fact that they would write the essay and think about it is a pretty good signal that they want to work in the company. Another way to think about it is that the best hire is somebody who really wants to work for you and who's really, really sharp. So I would avoid the functional start. The things I would look for, since people work in teams, they have to be, we want people who are super smart, they have to be capable of working with another person in the office. And there are people who, in fact, fail that test. So you want to be careful about that, and that's why you have the team interviews. But again, all of the successful startups that I've seen, Vinod, are run the way you said, an inordinate focus on the quality of the hiring, especially at the executive and key technical levels.
Yes, Seth.
Yes, hi, Seth.
As you guys were scaling Google, I'm not sure how many people it was when you got there, but I'm sure your processes kept breaking because you kept adding more and more people, and all of a sudden this team didn't know how to talk to that team, or these people didn't spend time with each other. And I have to imagine that happened at 100 people, and again at 200, again at 500. Did you ever find a way to kind of systematize finding when those internal processes and communications were going to break down and fixing it, or was it a constant, just you have to keep your eye on the ball?
It's a very good question. It's a constant focus. How do you know things are breaking down? It's when your objectives are not being met. So I gave you a science answer, which is you can measure the outcome of the company. So now you have a diagnostic. So how do you deal with it? Well, you get people to talk to each other. You're usually better off having decisions made by two people rather than one. This, again, is counterintuitive because everybody sees themselves as the Lone Ranger, making all their decisions. But if you force people to make a decision together, they will also get the systemic solutions working. Ultimately, you face platform issues. You don't have enough analytics. Another thing that I did not talk about in my notes is that you can run companies today incredibly analytically. You can know every single fact about creativity, product design, where they are, and that'll help you a lot. A typical example, when I joined the company, and at about 180 people, I was assigned a group office, which was fine, and then we moved around, and I moved to my own little office, which was 8 by 12. And I was traveling, and I came back, and I had a roommate. And his name was Amit, and he was there, right? So I had my table and his table, and I said hello, and I said, hello, what are you doing in a nice way? What are you doing here? And he said, well, my office was too crowded. I figured I'd move in with you. Okay, and I thought, okay, that's pretty interesting. It's like a new company, kind of countercultural. I don't want to commit some error here by kicking him out. So I said, well, who suggested you should move here? And Wayne Rosing was the VP of engineering, worked for me. And he said, I wandered over to see Wayne, and I said, my office is crowded. And Wayne said, move in with Eric. So I can't kick him out. Of course, I was quite angry at Wayne. So Amit basically had his headphones on all day, working on whatever he was working on, and he overheard me one day talking to the VP of sales, who was Omid, who was negotiating with me over the goal for the quarter at 100 million. And he said, by the way, I have some data for you. And I said, what? He said, the revenue is going to be 131. And I said, how do you know this? He said, I build the tools that forecast revenue. I said, you do? You're in engineering. You're in engineering. How do you know this? Oh, I've been doing it on my spare time. So I knew, because of my office mate, what the sales guys were doing. And we had this great negotiation as they slowly, got up to 131 million. I eventually told them that I had my mole next to me in my office, and we became very good friends. But it's an important lesson to know is that there's somebody in this company who understands the metrics that you need to make that decision. You need to find that person. I was lucky; he moved in. Bindu.
Yeah. Hey.
And you have an advantage as a former Google employee. You remember what crazy things we went through.
Yeah, no, great place to work. But looking back at your years at Google, what are the one or two things you would have done differently? Like, what would have been a better Google for you?
Well, first place, I'm still at Google. I should say so 10 years as a CEO. Now I'm executive chairman. I'm doing all the external stuff, and I'm an employee. So the errors that I made were all fundamentally about time. When I go back at where the company is today, had I done something 3 years ago or 4 years ago, which I sort of thought I should do, but I didn't do it because I was too polite, or I was in an argument, or Larry and Sergey and I disagreed, and I just decided not to fight, or I was wrong and they were right. But if you go back, it's ultimately all about I didn't move fast enough. And I've done this long enough. People in this room have done this long enough. You know what's wrong in your company. Why have you not fixed it now as opposed to 6 months from now when it gets worse? So in your case, for example, you worked on our sort of complex data stuff. We never quite got our strategy right. And by the way, you'll be humored to know that last night we were at our offsite meeting, and we're still talking about the same subject. It's like, why couldn't we? I know. Why can't we get this stuff right? There's something, we know it's important. Let's get it done. Go ahead.
Other questions?
You mentioned at the end of the meeting, many people would laugh.
Or feel good.
Oh,
Well, everybody here has had a manager and you've been managers, right? So you've seen the kind of manager that's this kind of tough, very decisive, respectful, but kind of rough manager. And you'll see or you'll watch this, and a friend of yours will go in and see this manager, and they come out, the guy's right, but they're demoralized. Productivity is terrible. There's got to be a way to deliver a tough message to you, but at the end say, I believe in you, I believe you can take this, I believe you can take this to the next level. I'll give you an example. We had 2 engineers who built a Wi-Fi service that was free. And they, being engineers, had written a grandiose plan to take over the world with free Wi-Fi. We did a product review, and we had a number of executives, and one of the executives knew a lot about the telco industry. At the time, we didn't. And this executive starts hammering them correctly in the meeting. At the end of the meeting, it's clear that they didn't know at all what they were doing. So you have 2 choices at that point. You can basically let them go to their office and be depressed, or you can say something. Right? So what did I say? I said, look, we love it when you guys bring up incredibly broad ideas. Your basic idea is really powerful. Take all this criticism, come back to see me in 3 weeks, and we're going to be really excited about what you come back with. Now, what's the value of that 20 seconds? Well, what happened was those 2 engineers came back with a proposal to then do free Wi-Fi for San Francisco. It cost us all of 2 routers, as best I could tell. It generated an enormous amount of press, right, and really helped the branding of the corporation. Right? Well worth the 20 seconds. It's important to remember. There are many, many examples. Remember, you're dealing with human beings, not robots. And if you yell at them enough, they can actually quit. Slavery is illegal. And in particular, if you offend their intelligence, right, it's in big trouble. There's got to be a way to get them to smile as they leave. And if they're not, and I don't mean gleefully. I mean they just with some respect.
Other questions? Yes. Let's get you a mic.
My name is Olga, and my question to you is, you said when people get yes without much of a fight, it's not a good thing. So how you can give an advice about how we can disagree and at the same time not to slide into hypocritical politeness?
Yeah.
Really, could you?
Yeah. It starts, I think, thank you very much, Olga, I understand your question. It starts with you have to establish a culture of professionalism in the corporation. Young corporations and young executives will often cross a line and they'll offend people personally. And that's never okay, and that's obvious. So let's assume we have a group of people who have some modicum of professional respect. They're sitting around the room. So if you watch the discussion, and it's sort of everyone's agreeing, you'll notice is some people will be doing nothing. They won't be agreeing or disagreeing. Call on them. Ask them their opinion. Try to find the person who's not speaking out and get them to say something that's disagreed by the others. You have to be incendiary. You have to get it started. When you find that person, they're going to they're going to say what they think, and then the person next to them will say, I agree with her. And then you have a real conversation. If you've not done that, in my view, you have not fundamentally led a team. Because the team is highly optimized, especially if you come into a meeting to agree with you. One day I was so upset over a whole bunch of things, I walked in and I talked for the entire staff meeting. And Larry and Sergey came over afterwards. They didn't normally say anything. And they said, like, you talked the entire meeting. I said, well, I had a lot to get done. I said, well, how do you know you're going to get anything done? You know, there was no signal back to me. It was a good lesson from Larry and Sergey. It's useful to have somebody who keeps you honest. At Google, in addition to the founders, I had a coach who's a brilliant fellow named Bill Campbell. So the combination of those helped keep me with that perspective, and I would encourage everybody to do something similar.
My name is Steve Liu. You talk about the importance of a strategic decision. We're going to have a session in the afternoon about the China opportunities. How do you view Google's eventual withdrawal from China? That decision obviously has been made, and what is how you view this decision right now, as compared to a year ago, six months ago?
Well, we are where we are. As you know, the Chinese government is a good place to do business unless you're committed to free speech and the blogosphere. And in the last 6 months, the Chinese government has had a pretty serious crackdown on free expression, even in the web in general. So it would be even harder today for Google to operate in China. So I think we are where we are. I think it's very sad because the citizens of China would strongly benefit, in my view, by access to broad Google. We're doing the best we can. But the Chinese government makes it difficult for us to operate even from Hong Kong.